Welcome to the Melbourne Press Club and today's very special event, Jobs After Journalism. It's great to see such an ecumenical gathering of journalism and academia today. Great to see. About 3 years ago, in this very venue, we hosted another event on the subject of life after redundancy. At that time, and that event focused to a large extent on the research work being done by the New Beats program based at La Trobe University. At that time, we talked about the loss of around 2,500 jobs from mainstream newsrooms around Australia. And here we gather today, 3 years later, and I think those statistics are considerably larger, somewhere north, I would believe, of 3,000. That said, it's very pleasing to see, indeed, around the room today, many former colleagues and others who have worked with over the years in mainstream media who have very skillfully and successfully repurposed themselves into other meaningful employment. Today, we take the conversation further, we take it globally, and it's a great pleasure for us to have with us today a panel of leading figures from around the world who are here in Melbourne particularly to talk around this subject and to talk about their experience, the experience of journalism in their countries in response to this fundamental change in our media industry, in our media landscape. I'll leave it to Laurie, Professor Laurie Zion from La Trobe, who will moderate this discussion today to introduce them in more detail, but to begin with, a welcome to Sergio, to Glenda, to Ari, and of course to Bintang. Brazil, Finland, South Africa and Indonesia. A very warm welcome to you all to the Melbourne Press Club. And we...
Hi everyone. I know you're enjoying your lunch. We are just going to ever so gently intrude. Thanks so much to Mark for that great introduction and for having us back. It was 3 years ago that we were last here talking about the New Beats project with a number of people from Melbourne who actually were sharing their experiences with us of the kind of work they'd been undertaking since their roles had been made redundant. I guess that most people here would be aware that the huge extent of job loss we've seen especially from legacy media in Australia, we're not alone in the world in that respect. And part of the, part of our kind of mission in the New Beats project is to explore what kind of studies into this process of job loss and job renewal and where journalists go both inside and outside of a rapidly reconfiguring media. We wanted to see what was happening in a range of other environments, and this week we've brought together people, they're not all here, but we've brought together people from 6 continents, and Indonesia is functioning as a continent for the purposes of this, as is Australia. So the North Americans are not part of this discussion today. They're joining us in Sydney on Friday. But I'm very pleased to welcome the team here, and I'll just introduce them one by one and say a little bit about them. So Glenda Daniels is a former and current journalist. We've been talking about journalist and academic identity a bit this week. So you're both for these purposes, Glenda. And she's an associate professor of media studies at Witwatersrand University in South Africa and coordinator and author of the South African annual State of the Newsroom reports. And for those who remember when the Press Council used to do those here, they're actually very similar. One of a number of similarities we've noticed this week. Next to Glenda, Ari Hanonen is also a former journalist/academic, journalist/academic now, and is currently Professor of Journalism at the University of Tampere in Finland. Next to Ari is Samyaji Bintang, who's Executive Director of the Institute for Press Development Studies in Jakarta. And next to Bintang is our research assistant and dear colleague Monica Winanita, who's going to help out with a bit of translation this afternoon with Bintang as well. And immediately to my right, Sergio Spagnuolo, who's the founder and editor of the data-driven news agency Volt Data Lab in Brazil. And you might be saying, well, what's that got to do with journalism redundancies? But in one of my many late-night Google searches, looking up journalism layoffs and entering different countries into the search query, I came across an article in the Neiman Journalism Lab about a data journalist in Brazil who'd stumbled upon the story of all of these journalists who from 2012 to 15 in Brazil had lost their jobs and what kinds of things they were doing now. And so I'm going to flick this over to you, Sergio. You tell the story a bit better than me, but how does a data journalist become a storyteller in this particular area?
Hello, good afternoon. So the story basically is like we are having a discussion with some friends, journalist friends working within newsrooms. I always worked within newsrooms in Brazil. And we're discussing over like GChat, what all the layoffs that were being reported in the media in the past few months. And someone came up with the question, well, how many journalists overall have been laid off in Brazil? And nobody knew. The unions didn't know, the Journalism Federation didn't know, and the government didn't know as well, because of some arcane kind of way they count, they consider journalists there. Like if you have a graduation in journalism, even if you are a baker or a dentist, you are considered a journalist for some reason, and they count them as journalists. So it kind of makes the number not representative at all. So I started to make inquiries all over the place and start to read a lot of the specialized media headlines about layoffs in Brazil, and just got all the numbers, created a big database and a tool for people to research, and we got the figure that since 2012 to April 2018, over 2,300 people lost their jobs within newsrooms in Brazil. It's not like an exact figure, there's probably much more, but that's how much we could track so far. So.
And do you know what they're doing now?
Yeah, a lot of those guys went to work for PR firms. There's a study there that says that over 50% of PR firms' staff are journalists. So a lot of those guys are working for public relations, but there's a lot of people as well that went to academia, or I have a friend that's a baker now, believe it or not. Another one that opens an olive shop. He only sells olive oil for some reason, and it's doing very well. And he's quite happy. But yeah.
So instead of yellow journalism, there's olive journalism now in Brazil.
Yeah.
Great. I'm just going to go and ask more or less the same question about, get a quick snapshot from all the different countries and ask a couple more questions, and then we're going to throw it open to the room. Glenda, can you tell us a bit about the situation in South Africa? And you've been very recently working full-time as a journalist, so you've been at the coalface and going in and out of academic roles. When did the large-scale job losses start in South Africa, and what happened?
I think it was actually 2013 and 2014 when we first started to notice that it was a huge amount of people. In fact, in all fairness, about 2011, 12, when it started happening in smaller numbers. So 2013, 2014, there were just over 1,000 journalists who were retrenched. And then, since then, every year they do it quietly, a couple of hundred here and a couple of hundred there, except for the SABC, which is the public broadcaster. We say public / state broadcaster. So the jobs there seem to be pretty protected. But if you are reskilling, actually, if you're doing multimedia and you're reskilling, for the rest, it's everything's a bit precarious at the moment.
With reskilling, are media organisations actively trying to retain staff by offering them reskilling programs?
No.
You're
No,
not?
no,
Okay.
no, there's no retraining at all. So, in fact, journalists who'll survive today will be those who are learning multimedia, mobile journalism, online blogging, etc. But the media houses themselves are not offering the training. And the journalism schools don't seem to be keeping up with what needs to be done, on the one hand. On the other hand, if they don't teach the basics, you're not going to be able to do the very basics in journalism anyway. So it's a bit of a conundrum, actually.
Can you tell us a bit about the process of, you used the word retrenchment, and we've been trying to analyse this very rich vocabulary and how it varies from country to country around journalism job loss. You used retrenchment in the case of South Africa. What does this actually mean in practical terms? Do people get what we would call a redundancy payment if their job goes?
Okay, so the context is that we have the Labour Relations Act, which protects workers. So when you say you're restructuring and you can then prove, your company can then prove that there are no profits, and in fact, I can't think of any one single company, media company in South Africa that's making any profit. So it's easy then to say we need to go through the next restructuring process. And that's all very legal to say we're going through restructuring. And the way they do this is to say, oh, okay, we've got a newsroom of 60 journalists, and we need to cut down to 30, so we want 30 of you to put your hands up. So, say to get a retrenchment package of whatever it is, 3 months' salary or something. It's very little, it's very low. Some people take it very quickly if they're over 60. And know they've got to go anyway. And then other people will say, well, don't put their hands up to go. And then they get tapped on the shoulder to say, actually, we don't need that beat anymore because we just don't need that beat anymore. We're just not doing beat journalism anymore. Everything will be covered by politics or news. So politics survives as a beat, and news, obviously, reporting survives as a beat. But all other things, such as the entertainment section, book reviews, film reviews, transport, the labour beat. I mean, there's so many other beats. Health seems to survive a bit. Not really, though, as a beat.
All sounds eerily familiar, especially as we're seeing Fairfax and arts journalists part ways. They're no longer, and I was an arts journalist for many years. That's a beat that's disappearing, certainly from the ranks of the full-time on-staff journalists at some of our main newspapers here. Ari Heinonen, what's been the scale of job loss that you can discern in Finland, and how have people who've lost their jobs dealt with all the issues that come with that?
Yes, good afternoon to all. Actually, perhaps I should say something about the scale, because Finland is a small country with only 5.5 million people, about the same as I think in Melbourne altogether. So the journalistic workforce and media workforce is much smaller than in many other countries like South Africa or Brazil. 2015, according to the official statistics, there were about 35,000 people working in whole media sector, including everything from book publishing to film industry. And in the course of 10 years, 5,000 jobs were lost in media sector. Now, about journalism, there are no exact figures, unfortunately, available. But according to the best estimates, it is said that during past 10 years, something like 20% of newsroom jobs have been lost in Finland. That includes all journalists and other personnel working in newsrooms. Not all of those people who have lost their jobs have gone out of journalism, but instead they may go to start freelancing, other forms of self-employment, or doing journalism and other stuff as to make their living. Some go to PR, as in many other countries as well, and so forth. How they have dealt with that? Well, it depends on the individuals. Of course, those who are, as Glenda here said, who are more, let's say, work longer are a bit older, they make it retirement packages and they are very happy with that and start doing nothing. And the others may get some kind of a redundancy packages as well, which will cover their living for the time they are searching for the new job or starting their own company or freelance career. But then, of course, this is only the financial part of how to deal with this. There's also, in each individual case, there's also the mental or, let's say, psychological thing. And our study, where we interviewed several journalists who had lost their jobs, said that it's not only losing your income, it's also losing your colleagues, your career, which may have been your dream since childhood, and losing the networks of people, and sort of making you wonder whether you are needed at all in this society anymore.
And it's interesting over the last couple of days hearing Ari talk about this in our group, because we've just completed the final of 4 annual surveys where some of those responses he's referred to there sound very, very familiar, and we even floated the idea that maybe we've had the same respondents who've also learned Finnish and are filling in the same forms for the same kind of surveys that have been done there. But it does seem that the range of experiences is actually very, very similar, and I think we've been noting that across the board. Bintang, tell us about what you know about the scale of job loss in Indonesia and how journalists there are coping with this quite sudden change in their circumstances.
Okay, terima kasih. Selamat siang, good afternoon. Thank you. I will explain in Bahasa since my English is not so fluent. So, di Indonesia hilangnya pekerjaan untuk para jurnalis ini juga cukup besar ya. Hanya saja memang kalau di Indonesia cukup sedikit media-media yang memberitakan terkait dengan job loss, hilangnya pekerjaan ini.
So in Indonesia, there were only a small amount of media that reported the job loss.
Tapi di dalam tubuh media itu sendiri banyak sebenarnya, cuman hanya saja para jurnalis ini enggan untuk menyampaikan atau melaporkan bahwa mereka sudah kehilangan pekerjaan. Kemudian karena banyak media juga di Indonesia yang sudah mulai tutup, terutama untuk yang media-media cetak.
So actually there are a lot of journalists that have lost their jobs within the sort of media companies, but they are reluctant to talk about it. And also that, in particular, print media, from the print media.
Yeah.
I want to get back to that theme about what experiences journalists are reluctant to share sometimes. We'll go into that in a minute. But another point you've raised is that in a 5-year period, almost half of the print news titles in Indonesia have gone. Can you tell us a bit about what's happened? Have these publications simply converted from print to online, or are a lot of them disappearing altogether?
Ya, ada beberapa yang media benar-benar tutup selesai, tidak menerbitkan lagi, tapi beberapa jurnalisnya justru berkeinginan untuk menghidupkannya lagi, lalu menghidupkannya melalui media online. Beberapa juga ada yang sudah bertransformasi ke media online digital untuk menyasar target audiens kaum muda, karena kebanyakan yang berlangganan untuk media-media cetak itu generasi yang sudah tua, sementara mereka ingin menyasar generasi yang lebih muda.
So quite a lot of the print media have closed, and also that they have then transferred and become an online sort of digital media. And the reason why is that they wanted to target the younger audience. So a lot of the older sort of journalists have not been able to transfer their skills into the online digital media from print. So it's more the
but
younger.
it's not just a skill gap then, it's that they're not necessarily regarded as being capable of talking to a younger generation as well?
Ya, sepertinya demikian karena teman-teman yang lebih muda banyak menggunakan bahasa-bahasa pemahaman-pemahaman isu-isu yang mudah dipengerti oleh kaum muda ketimbang yang generasi tua yang lebih banyak bicara soal politik yang lebih kompleks seperti itu.
So that's correct, Laurie. So it isn't just skills, but it is also about speaking to the younger audience, because the younger journalists have got the language to speak to the younger audience, while the older generation of journalists, they talk about politics and society at a more complex level. He said then that does not really translate to the younger audience and the kind of language that the younger journalist would write their stories in.
I'm going to throw a question now to the panel in general, and it's about this idea of journalism as part of a broader career mix. Now, we've just, in our final survey where we're still crunching the data, we looked and saw that of all the people who've been doing our surveys over the last few years, about 60% of them say they're doing some kind of journalism work, but only 10% altogether are actually doing what you call a full-time journalism job. And only 10% have been in the one kind of work role since they've been redundant, and they've either been going serially from job to job or having portfolio careers with a range of different things going on across a period of a few years. So in a way, they're almost like suddenly joined what we've learnt in the report from the Australia Institute here a few days ago. The now majority of people who are not working in jobs that are full-time with all the benefits like sick leave and annual leave that go with that. So that seems to be a big theme in the case of Brazil, that people are stepping out of the kind of legacy job framework and striking out and seeking new opportunities. And I guess you're part of that movement of people setting up their own small companies. Is there a lot of optimism about what can be achieved there?
No.
I tried, but yeah.
No, I'm kidding. I mean, it's if you are a journalist and you have all the skills that you acquire during your long career, your specialized career, doing in-depth reporting and all this kind of stuff, and then you are out of a job, maybe that's something that will be only useful for journalism and maybe not somewhere else. I don't think that's the case, but a lot of people feel like that. I have a news agency in Brazil. We are just 4 people. It's me and 3 staff. And I have one journalist, a tech guy that doesn't have any formal education, but he's quite a news enthusiast. And my analyst, Renata, she was a journalist, and she quit journalism and is now attending statistics school in Brazil. And that's why I hired her. I didn't hire her because she was a journalist. I hired her because she's now becoming a statistician, right? So there's been
a journalist with numeracy skills.
That's right.
There you go. That's a good mix.
It was a great mix for us, and she's a very valuable person to our company. But I've been seeing that a lot. Like a lot of journalists are getting their second degree, right? Economics or even law. There are a lot of journalists doing law degrees, especially because now Brazil has been going through a very rough political phase, and it's quite rough. And we are trying to understand better and get a better grasp of what's going on. So there's been a lot of sideline specialization for journalists. I'm not sure if that happens here. I believe in some way, but as I talk to other journalists in Brazil, I feel there's kind of a hopelessness. Like they really don't feel engaged their work anymore, most of them. But there's a new kind of opportunity in Brazil right now that's from new news startups, like very niche, small shops that are doing like great, meaningful, impactful work. And so a lot of journalists are trying to get out of big legacy newsrooms and get in those organizations that are more flexible about like the shifts they work, that have some kind of good wages as well, because it's not usually it's not formal contract work. It's more of a freelance thing, but it's a fixed freelance. So I mean, there's opportunity there right now, and it's kind of I don't mean to bring you down, Laurie, but it's kind of a rough time for journalism right now.
Glenda, what are you seeing in terms of people who try to remake their careers in South Africa?
Look, my answer is not no, it's all bad. It's actually yes or no. And it's a mixed bag of fortune, because I'm actually seeing both. You know, I've got friends who said, you've got to jump, you don't need to save a whole year's salary to go freelance. And then they do it, they make a success of it. And then you have others, I have other friends who've told me, I'm really battling, I'm really struggling, you know, it's literally a day-to-day existence, and can you help me by getting anything at the university that I can do, even if it's for 1 hour a month or something. So it literally ranges from that end, where I've had friends who were editors who are now doing what we call the gigs. So gigs are basically, they regard themselves as doing parties. And we know gigs, the word gigs to be parties, but gigs now means the gig economy, meaning you do a day of a week. I mean, a day a week at the Huffington Post as editor there, and then you do another day sub-editing somewhere else, and then you spend another day on your master's thesis, and then you spend another day having coffee and having meetings with people to see what entrepreneurial opportunities there are out there, etc. So that's what's called the gigs. However, I have to say that the majority of people who've lost their jobs have actually found jobs in PR. And when I ask them, they say, you're not allowed to quote me. So now I'm quoting them, but I'm not using their names. They hate it, actually. They find it very, very difficult to have made the move from journalism, where you actually have a passion, you feel like you're doing something that's part of a greater cause, the right thing, to expose corruption, etc. And then suddenly you're on the other side, and it's called, what's the opposite of throwing shade? It's what young people say today, whatever, throwing sugar or something. So basically everything is sugary, and they find it very hard. So academia is one thing, people doing masters and PhD degrees. The gig economy is another, going into PR and government communications, where people are finding jobs, and it's just a job. And, you know, it's now not a career anymore, it's just a job. They go and write press statements for government. And then there are other people who, you know, if I had the time, I'd be doing the same, upskilling and reskilling, etc. I don't know what content producing means, whether it's the same as stories, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Both you and Bintang have mentioned that journalists can be quite reticent in sharing their experiences. Is it connected to journalists feeling like this is not how it was meant to turn out, and I don't really want to talk about it because I'm not ready to, or are there other reasons? And maybe I'll start with Bintang and then go to Glenda. Yeah.
Dalam riset yang kami lakukan, kami juga menemui kendala itu ya, untuk meminta penjelasan dari rekan-rekan jurnalis ini, terutama alasan-alasan yang kenapa mereka tidak mau berpartisipasi dalam survei yang kami lakukan. Tapi mungkin barangkali ini terkait dengan ego ya, para jurnalis yang ya kita nggak tahu, biasanya para teman-teman jurnalis ini lebih selfish seperti itu. Jadi mereka nggak mau share tentang pengalaman ini, dan mereka lebih banyak menyimpannya, terus kemudian sambil mencari jalan keluar yang lain, seperti itu.
So Bintang was telling about how it has been very difficult to get participants for the survey, And he thinks that it's really to do also with the journalist's ego, the ego itself, and the kind of self sort of preservation as such. And it's very hard for him to find journalists who would share their experience, finding it really hard to get a job.
Ini mungkin karena pengalaman seperti musibah gitu loh. Mereka mengalami kekecewaan berat, terus kemudian sehingga mereka sendiri nggak mau men-share itu kepada yang lain seperti itu.
So it's like a disaster that happened to them, a personal disaster that happened to them, so they don't want to share. So he said share as well before. He finds it very hard for them to share their personal disaster.
And I know from talking to Bintang, these surveys that are completely anonymous. They're not having their name used in publications or anything like that. Glenda, has this been something you found in South Africa as well, that there's a kind of crisis that stops people from talking about what they've been through?
You know, I actually don't know what it's about, because if I had to say to a former journalist, won't you sit down and have coffee with me and I'll buy you lunch and let's talk, they'll say absolutely. And the minute it is about, I want to share my personal story, they worry about getting the next job, because they will talk to me off the record quite freely because they trust me and know me. But the minute it comes to, now I want to tell my story about how I got kicked upstairs. Kicked upstairs is a term we use in South Africa to say you got sent up to management. There's another word for it is mahogany row. I think it's because of the suits or the furniture. I don't know what the brand means, but so you have editors who say, how do you categorize me who got kicked upstairs? So in other words, I was really enjoying the newsroom. I was enjoying being an editor and looking after my journalists and assigning stories. And then suddenly I got kicked upstairs, meaning I'm now doing whatever, some managing editing job where I'm dealing with money. And of course, journalists, as you know, well, the majority of us don't know anything about money. So that's the kind of story you hear. You know, people are happy and willing to talk on a one-to-one basis, but the minute you put a survey out and their life stories out there, they fear they're not going to get the next job, actually, if they tell what they tell.
Has this been an anxiety, Ari, for people who you've been surveying in Finland? And what have you learnt from talking to them about how they see not just their place in the world, but what's happening also to journalism more generally?
Well, first, we have to remember that those people to whom we have been talking, they have volunteered to participate in the study. So we don't know about those journalists who have lost their jobs and didn't come forward to participate in the study. It might be interesting to talk with them, but how to reach them is difficult. But those journalists who came forward and participated in the survey, they were quite willing to talk about what had happened, how they felt, what were their opinions of the media and management of media especially, and the future of journalism. Actually, we first made a telephone survey, and already at that stage, some phone calls lasted a long time, because somehow at some points we sort of felt that these journalists had only been waiting for someone to listen to their stories. So that it was sort of this research was sort of a therapy, at least, for some of them. Yeah. How they felt about journalism. And first about how they felt about the media. Of course, they were bitter because their fate had been quite unfortunate one. And they used very, put it mildly, critical words about the current state of media management or management of media companies in Finland. And they saw that the future of journalism, if it continues to be that kind of logic that runs journalism, that profits is the most important thing, that you have to be so cost effective that you don't have enough journalists to cover important things, that is very likely to lead to a sort of a vicious circle. But of course, we have to understand their opinions that they are talking in certain kind of situations, personal situations. I think that those journalists who have entered the job, younger ones, they might see things a bit differently. But the overall assessment of especially media management was very negative, I should say.
Thanks for that. I'm going to throw it open to the room now. So just, if anyone's got a question, raise your hand and a microphone will find you. Does anyone want to ask a question? Yeah.
Tony Thomas from Quantum Magazine. It is very fortunate
You have to turn it on.
that the government is
Oh, we might just wait for you to
Flick it back
wait for
on.
the microphone to go on. Sorry.
Tony Thomas from Quadrant Magazine. It's very fortunate in one sense that as fast as journalists are losing their jobs, the government's expanding its PR functions. I had a couple of examples of this. I gather that each level crossing job that the state government's doing has its own individual PR person. The other day I needed to find out something about the courts. I went to the Vic Police, there's PR people. They referred me to the Magistrates Court, which has its own PR person. That person said, no, go to the Federal Police, so a PR person there. That person said, it's probably a Supreme Court or a County Court job. Each of them has their own PR person, so I went to each of the two. And finally, thanks to all this work, I identified the case as being in the County Court. So that's just an example of how prolific the PR people are, while, of course, the journalist cohort is shrinking at a great rate. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And I guess the question that I'd ask from that is, are we seeing in areas where traditionally the bread and butter journalism, court reporting, has declined to a point where in certain communities journalism's not doing its civic job? Just a quick comment from everyone here before we go to the next question. Bintang.
Ya, untuk hal-hal yang serius, yang penting, memang itu tidak kurang menjadi perhatian buat teman-teman jurnalis yang terutama yang digital atau media online, karena mereka lebih menyasar banyak audiens. Ini yang menjadi masalah baru buat audiens di Indonesia, karena itu juga kurang menjadi perhatian publik.
So it's become less of a public attention to write about serious kind of matters because the target audience is really digital. Because it is digital, there is less content that are more serious content about politics and society.
Ari, in Finland, are there news deserts? I don't normally associate Finland with deserts, but is the same thing happening there?
Not really. I would say that there's not any individual beat that would have suffered more than the rest. It's been like that. All newsrooms overall have become thinner. Well, one area which has suffered, but not only recently, but in a longer course of time, is foreign correspondents. So that the Finnish media, both newspapers, commercial newspapers, and public broadcaster, they don't have that many correspondents in various parts of the world than they used to be some years ago.
I'm just wondering, thinking out loud, has there ever been a Finnish foreign correspondent in Australia that you're aware of?
No.
Okay. We might have missed that boat. Sergio, what about in Brazil? Is there a concern that there are just things of great public importance that are no longer being covered properly by the media?
Yes, definitely. Special local legislatures, is that the word? Yeah.
Like state governments?
Yeah, state government. They're very important to civic life there, and they're not covered. And I just want to say I feel the pain of my Australian friend over there, because in Brazil, not only each institution has their own PR army, but they hire outside PR firms to deny media requests. Like they don't want to see the bad guys, so they hire other people to just stall us all the time. So it's getting increasingly hard to get good information out of institutions there.
What about PR well, you've mentioned a lot of journalists go into it and they don't like it in South Africa.
Yeah.
Are there other consequences for the flow of information in South Africa
Yeah.
as well?
Look, I start to get nauseous when I talk about PR, so I'm not going to talk about PR. But just to say that there are more PR people in South Africa now than there are journalists. So say at one time we had 10,000 journalists, we've probably got 2,500 journalists now and 10,000 PR people. But having said that, and I don't want everything to seem like all doom and gloom because it's not. Our investigative journalism has actually brought down a corrupt president, and for that, I'm really, really proud of. I worked at Amabungani myself as an advocacy person on media freedom issues, and that's the investigative press. So they pulled out of the newsroom, and this may well be a model. It's not really business because it's a non-profit, not-for-profit organization, NPOs they called. So you basically crowdsource funding, and you get funding from Facebook and donors. I mean, I myself donate to investigative units. We have about 4 of them. They all compete with each other. And if it wasn't for investigative journalism in the country, we'd still have a corrupt president. So we mustn't feel totally depressed about the situation. What's going to survive in the future, I mean, okay, if I'm wrong in 10 years' time, you can tell me I was
We'll
wrong.
have you back,
But what will
yeah.
survive will be artificial intelligence doing ordinary news reporting, and then the social media, and definitely investigative journalism. So when journalists ask me today, how do we survive journalism? I say by doing good journalism. What is good journalism? It's journalism that's in the public interest. What is in the public interest is to blow out corruption right out of the water. You know, the rich and the famous and the powerful politicians, there's so much corruption going on. There's more than enough stories to make journalism good and what it once was.
Thanks for that, Glenda. And that theme has been iterated a lot in the media here recently with the Banking Royal Commission that's been held and the now avalanche of stories that are flowing from an inquiry that not too long ago our government thought we mustn't have. So there's been a big change there. Other questions? Yes.
Barry Donovan, Melbourne Press Club. A very good Australian journalist by the name of Laura Tingle wrote a very interesting commentary piece recently on the way that politics is covered today and important political stories, both here and in Canberra. But what she centred it on was what she described very effectively as political amnesia. And what she was talking about basically was where you have experienced journalists who still have some memory of what happened and what went wrong in government and decisions that were badly made, going back prior to the 1990s, for example. But what she was more and more concerned about was, and this is not a reflection necessarily on younger journalists, but what she was concerned about was that when a younger group of journalists were in the press gallery in Melbourne or here, in Melbourne or Canberra, were looking at a story about what a new decision made by government, which was obviously got a bad response. And with older journalists, they could look back and compare it to what did happen in, heavens, 1985, for example, and they can compare the government as to how it made its decision now, where it was wrong, and why it hadn't picked up mistakes that were made by government in the 80s or the 90s. And that was something that she was particularly concerned about, and I wonder if that sort of thing is happening in your
So the loss of historical context when it comes to reporting.
No reference back to something that might have happened 10 years ago.
Ari, I'll hand my microphone to you.
Yes, we recognize in Finland also this kind of development, but And that's evident that is happening when typically the media wants to get rid of the older and more expensive journalists, and if they are hiring freshmen. But at the same time, as a journalism teacher as well as a researcher, I think it's part of our responsibility, because the situation is what it is. And if our graduates are going to get jobs, it's our duty, at least partly, to make sure that they have the historical memory, they understand the contexts of their reporting and so on and so forth. So I don't think that what I try to say, I guess, is that there's something that can be done, and what can be done is pretty much that we improve our journalism education.
Baik, di Indonesia hal yang sama juga terjadi ya, amnesia tentang ini, terutama untuk kalangan muda, karena apa yang terjadi saat ini di Indonesia terjadi perpecahan politik, fragmentasi antara pendukung pemerintah dengan yang oposisi, seperti yang non Jokowi, seperti itu. Terus kemudian ya yang terjadi saat ini sehingga karena amnesia tadi, amnesia politik atau sejarah ini. Dan itu banyak dipublikasi melalui media online, dan media-media online di Indonesia senangnya yang berita-berita yang sensasional yang tidak memberikan konteks politik.
So in Indonesia, this is a situation, political amnesia, and to have a historical context, and especially now where there is a political situation between the Jokowi presidency and those who are against him. When you write for media online, there is no context, historical, political context to understanding Indonesia's political situation.
Joy.
I think somebody performing.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Michelle Piney from Independent Australia. I was just interested in some of the panel touched on this, on people who've been retrenched, being unwilling or unable to talk about their experiences, and how much of that is actually driven by perhaps the corporations and governments with ever-increasing public relations personnel trying to control the narrative, and if that's the case, what's the answer?
Yeah, I do. I think that's absolutely, you answered your own question. That's exactly what it is. They're afraid of that. But I just want to talk about the institutional memory issue, because that really gets at me, and I'll come back to that. It's, mentorships are very important in the newsrooms, and now newsrooms cannot afford mentors anymore. So we do get stories without any context. So the fact remains, we should stop dissing young people. They can get it, and they should get it. They're not reading because there's nothing to read. That's political. So unfortunately, we do need those mentors in newsrooms to say the context, the second paragraph. So, sometimes if they're doing a story and they don't know that the nexus between corruption, public sector and private sector corruption has, in our country, for instance, with investigative journalism, Bell Pottinger, KPMG, all these huge McKinsey, huge multinational corporations have been rent asunder by the facts that the theft that's been going on. It's been fantastic what the journalists have done. So when somebody then in a newsroom says KPM who and what and Bell Potter, not knowing that these are PR firms and that sort of thing, all you need is a mentor to be there and tell them and put them in the right direction, and then they do get it. So in relation to the sad stories that people don't want to tell, look, I think we must accept that there's a bit of embarrassment, there's a bit of shame at losing your job. It's very natural, it's very human. one has to have compassion. And then the other side of the story, of course, is that person needs to support his or her family and needs to find another job. So they've got to protect themselves, and sometimes they're embarrassed to tell you afterwards, I'm really sorry, I know what you're going to think of this, Glenda, but I've had to go to government. I'm now in the Department of Transport doing press releases, and I'm sorry. And I say, don't say sorry to me, you need a job. So sometimes one's got to, even though one is idealistic, one's got to accept that certain people have to feed their children and educate their children and pay their rent.
I just want to make a side note here. It's pretty common, I guess worldwide, that we vilify PR people. It's a job as any other. It's a nice job. It's an honorable job most of the time. Journalists can be unhonorable as well, dishonorable, right? But it's a great job to have when you are unemployed and you go there and you find a job. I have friends that assimilated very well as PR, and they love it way more than they did the newsrooms. I worked 11 months as a UN FLAC in Brazil for a project, UNDP project there. I didn't enjoy very much the work. I loved the people and the institution, but I didn't like the job very much. But I have a lot of friends that do work as a PR, and they really like it, and they do great work about that. But so there's maybe, I don't know, just want to defend the PR, sorry.
And I'll second that by saying a number of people who've done our surveys have said, that in the case where they're in PR companies where they believe in the cause or what the company's actually doing, that in some ways they feel more effective in creating positive change than they did in a media where they were doing, in a newspaper where they were just suddenly doing 5 or 6 stories a day. So there's a full spectrum of responses there, I guess. Joe.
Oh, hi. Jo Chandler at the Centre for Advancing Journalism now, but I've been freelancing for the last 5 years, since taking a redundancy from The Age after 20-something years. I had a couple of observations and then a question that comes out of them, but as fast as I can. When I left The Age, I remember thinking about where there was opportunity, and somebody mentioned before about the disappointment of people when they felt that they were leaving behind their dreams when they left the newsroom. In fact, I decided to pursue them when I left the newsroom, but I did have the luxury of 20-something year payout from The Age to subsidise and keep me going, and kids that were big enough to dumpster dive for themselves if worse came to worse. But it was a very interesting process over the next 5 years, but I kept thinking, what's the point in terms of a strategic plan of being another one of dozens of redundant journalists working the Melbourne or Victorian beat, all kind of falling over themselves with a very limited amount of market in which to sell those stories. So I sort of tried to step back and say, well, my interests, skills, contacts and background are all about, say, Pacific journalism, climate journalism, hard to tell stories from hard to reach places. They're expensive to fund, but if I can find a way to do them, they're also that's where you'll get to pick up $1 a word and maybe more, particularly if you can crack international publications. Largely that plan worked. It was, difficult at times, but it largely did work. But one of the reasons it worked was finding my way into the network where there's little pots of money from philanthropics that are investing, whether it's the Knight Foundation or the Pulitzer Centre for Public Journalism and Crisis Journalism, crowdsourced money that was coming up in particular areas here that would allow me a pot to get, to get to Manus or somewhere. So that's sort of, without that kind of thing, you can't do that value-added journalism that Glenda was talking about. What can we do as mid-career, often deeply experienced, redundant journalists that either a graduate or a robot can't do. The challenge we have here is that we do not have a philanthropic culture that is interested or sort of aligned into supporting journalism. We don't have a culture that supports the notion of public money going into journalism in the way that I think the French and some others are now going. So whether in your countries you're facing similar obstacles in terms of trying to find pots of philanthropy or public money that might invest in sort of the hollow areas of deep reporting, and whether you've had any success in that, and whether you have any suggestions about what we should be doing to find and encourage that kind of funding model?
Philanthropic money for journalism in Brazil is very rare. there is some, but it's quite rare. But what a lot of journalists are doing in Brazil, freelance journalists are doing in Brazil, is that they are digging stuff by themselves. I have a friend that's just came back from Iraq, doing some reporting there, and he was able to make quite some money out of that. Like he was paying everything out of his own pocket to get there and stuff. But he got some to publish his stuff in Brazilian news outlets, and he got some money out of that as well. So, I mean, you gotta be a little bit entrepreneur if you are freelancing, I guess. It's hard to wait for people to come and commission you to do this kind of thing. There's a New York Times freelance journalist that was investigating piracy in the world. It was a great story, like set of stories. It was very good, and so he was very successful at that. So I think that people should be a little, freelancer could be a little bit of entrepreneurs themselves to go dig stories by themselves and sell them to the media or some NGO maybe, I don't know.
In Finland, yeah, Ari.
Yeah, first of all, I'm glad that you brought up this brighter side of redundancies or starting over again, because many of our interviewees as well said that leaving behind the stressful atmosphere of newsrooms and starting to do things by their own, by themselves as a freelancer or other forms of self-employed communicator was sort of a relief and really a new beginning in bright side of the way. And many of them felt that they are more satisfied now than they used to be in their permanent job, which wasn't so permanent after all. But about the funding opportunities for independent journalism, so to say, in Finland, these are very rare as in Brazil as well. There's one exception. There's actually the largest media company in Finland has run this sort of competition for innovations in journalism, which funds new ideas so that startups can develop them. And one of the award winners is a small startup which is doing long-form journalism online only. And that's really quality journalism. I know most of the journalists, and they're there, and they are really top class. They are young, actually, but they are doing really good investigative journalism about important things. But unfortunately, this is only one example. Mostly, the startups that they put up, or in the field of journalism or former employed journalists do, is that they do partly journalism, partly perhaps PR, partly something else, so that they are sort of ambitious to do quality journalism, but in order to survive, they have to do something, often everything else as well.
Bintang in Indonesia, is there philanthropic organisations that support the kind of journalism that would otherwise not get the stories that wouldn't get told?
Ya, sebenarnya baru-baru ini ada kolom yang ditulis di Columbia Journalism Review tentang, termasuk ini di Indonesia, bahwa filantropi untuk media itu di Indonesia, termasuk bahkan di Asia sendiri, itu sangat minim yang concern untuk membantu media dan jurnalisme yang independen. Yang banyak terjadi adalah bahwa justru banyak politisi yang mendirikan media atau membentuk media yang ini hanya sebagai kendaraan untuk mengkampanyekan citra politiknya.
So the Columbia Journalism Review actually did an article about philanthropy and also mentions Indonesia. And actually in Indonesia it's very minimal. So there is minimal amount of philanthropy help for independent journalists. Now what is happening in Indonesia is that there's actually politicians who owned media companies, and they do so just to further their own political positions. Yeah.
Right. Glenda.
I want to answer your second question first. What should you be doing as a mid-career journalist? I don't know the answers, but I think what I would say to anyone in South Africa, if they said that to me, I'd say go to the journalism departments in your city and ask them to start teaching new journalism, actually. And then that way you're reskilling, because the media companies themselves are not going to be doing that. And the most important thing to do right now is to learn mobile journalism, how to do journalism on your smartphone. And then the other thing, in South Africa, in fact, there's a huge culture of giving money towards investigations. In fact, that's how the big 4 investigative units are surviving. But it depends on the culture of the country. If a country really, really believes in exposing what ought to be exposed, say, for instance, there's a corrupt politician who's involved in a sexual harassment case. In South Africa, that's front page news. It's a scoop, and very soon that politician will be out of a job. If there's a culture, I was in Switzerland once, and they said, what you do in your country compared to what we do here, there's an old boys network there, and it's related to the journalists, government, and business people. And I, of course, my jaw dropped, because it's exactly the opposite. We view with huge suspicion politicians and rich business people, because, you know, it's just, you just shouldn't be, the water shouldn't be muddied and blurred like that at all. So we do have a culture of supporting this, because we've seen what the role of the media, okay, I should say news media, in a democracy is. It can bring about change. So if there isn't that culture and uncomfortable things get pushed under the carpet, then in fact people are not going to be so interested in journalism that exposes corruption.
Thanks, Glenda. We've got time for just one last question. And yeah, Matthew.
Thanks very much. Matthew Ricketson from Deakin University, also a member of the New Beats team with some colleagues. I had a pessimistic question, but I think we've had enough pessimistic kind of questions, so I wanted to ask a potentially more optimistic one, which is, in the various countries that you're coming from, have you noticed or observed in your studies any kind of green shoots, if you like, any of the people who've taken redundancy packages, who've gone and either created new and interesting ways of doing journalism, or media startups, or things of that nature? I'm just wondering if you can talk to us a bit about that part of the landscape in your own countries. Thank you.
All right, I'll quickly go around the panel for this.
Yeah. Very quickly. Yes, there have been some that went on and created new stuff. There are quite few news initiatives in Brazil, new news initiatives in Brazil right now. I guess there's like in the past 4 years, maybe 30-something new initiatives. So it's quite good right now. I wasn't fired from my job before, but I was quite sick of it. So I went on and created my own startup. And it's been a good field in Brazil to explore. And I think that there might be a lot of opportunity there, at least right now.
Thanks. Bintang, new shoots in Indonesia.
Ya, inovasi. Ya. Ada beberapa yang sedang dicoba oleh teman-teman, terutama jurnalis-jurnalis yang masih muda, sehingga mereka mencari isu-isu yang tidak diangkat oleh media-media mainstream. Mereka mencoba menyasar audiens yang familiar dengan gadget, dengan teknologi baru. Dan ini sudah mulai dikembangkan, hanya saja memang model bisnisnya belum terlihat apakah akan berlanjut sampai waktu yang cukup lama.
Okay, actually, there has been some innovation, particularly from younger journalists who are doing media online, a lot of digital kind of media, and also targeting stories about gadgets and new innovations, also technological news. However, the kind of business model for the sort of new innovative startup by young journalists, we don't know yet whether or not it's sustainable, whether the business model itself is sustainable.
Ari.
I would say that there have been some interesting startup efforts in Finland. Also some encouraging freelance job done there, but the sustainable business model for journalistic startups is not there as yet. And I think it's important to remember that still at the moment most journalists in Finland have permanent jobs in mainstream media. And mainstream media is, after all redundancies and their profit margins going a bit lower, they are still doing strong. So by and large, the media landscape, news media landscape, is not being shaken to any extent in Finland, at least as yet.
Last word to you, Glenda.
Well, I think that, in fact, the potential lies in the reskilling. And in fact, people are talking about that. So you get the 21-year-old, you have a company where you get 21-year-olds to sit with you and show you back end and front end. I mean, some of us don't really know what that is, but website stuff, right? How you actually upload things, very basic things that some of us don't know, that are learning these things, and how to do video journalism and uploading of videos. So that is really the green shoot area that we can all, I mean, you know, just because one's over 40 or whatever, doesn't mean we can't learn the new skills. We actually can.
All right, I'm sorry we've run out of time, but I want to thank everyone for coming this afternoon. I want to really thank the Melbourne Press Club for having us back for our global version of a New Beats panel. And I really want to thank this bunch of people here from travelling all the way around the world to spend a week with us. So Bintang, Ari, Glenda, Sergio, thanks so much for coming here and for sharing your experiences with us today and right across this week. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Laurie. And if I could just add the thanks to the club to you all for coming. It's been a special, treat to have such a distinguished international panel and to realise that we are not alone in the challenges that face us, and to hear that there are opportunities as well that are rising out of this. It's also delightful for a first today that we have Bahasa Indonesia on our stage. So thank you all for coming, and thank you.